A United States military police sergeant grabbed an Australian warrant officer by the collar on a humid street in Vung Tau in the summer of 1968, threw him against a stucco wall, and snapped handcuffs onto his wrists while a dozen Australian infantrymen watched in frozen disbelief. The Australian did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head and said 8 words that would ricochet up 2 separate chains of command, land on the desk of a brigadier at Nui Dat by sunrise, and produce a diplomatic incident the United States Army would spend the next 6 months trying to bury in classified filing cabinets. Those 8 words. "We do not recognize that rank, young man." Wait, what? An Australian with a crown on his sleeve, a man who had survived 2 tours with the training team, a man who had been commanding Montagnard strike companies while that American sergeant was still in high school, just got handcuffed like a drunk private outside a bar on Lloy Street. And the U.S. Army military police genuinely believed they had the authority to do it. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because what happened in the hours after those handcuffs clicked shut, the phone calls that were made, the jeep dispatched at high speed, the American provost marshal who opened his office door that afternoon to find a red-faced Australian major screaming at him in language that could strip paint off a bulkhead, none of it would have happened if anyone in the United States Army had bothered to read a single paragraph of Commonwealth rank doctrine. One classified memo circulated later that year to every American provost marshal in country contained a sentence that gave the whole game away. 11 words that were half apology, half confession. Australian warrant officers are to be treated as senior commissioned equivalents. You are about to discover why the tiny port town of Vung Tau, the supposed paradise where every Allied soldier in Vietnam came to drink beer and forget the war, became a dangerous diplomatic flashpoint in the entire Australian-American alliance. And by the end of this, you will understand why Australian military police, working the same streets, in the same uniforms with the same pistols, looked at their American counterparts and quietly concluded that the Americans did not actually know what country they were standing in. Stay with me. The thing about Vung Tau that every American in country got wrong, from the newest private stepping off the C-130 to the brigadier general running Military Assistance Command Vietnam from his air-conditioned office in Saigon, was that Vung Tau was not an American town. On paper, of course, Vung Tau belonged to the Republic of Vietnam. French colonial builders had laid out its streets in the 19th century when they called the place Cap Saint-Jacques. South Vietnamese police, the white-uniformed Can Sat, known to every soldier in country as the White Mice, patrolled its markets. But on the ground, in the bars along Front Beach and Back Beach, in the narrow streets where Vietnamese landladies rented villas to field clerks and warrant officers, in the pressed sandlots where Australian engineers had bulldozed out a swimming pool and named it the Harold Holt Memorial Pool, Vung Tau was effectively an Australian town. It had been an Australian logistics hub since April 1966, when the first Australian Logistics Support Group had dragged its tents and its pallets and its scrounged American spare parts onto the shifting dunes of Back Beach. The Americans never really understood this. Americans saw a coastal resort with bars and massage parlors and rolling surf, and they saw a rest and recreation center where their soldiers could drink for 3 days between patrols and forget the smell of burning foliage. American soldiers came through by the thousands. The United States 36th Evacuation Hospital operated there. Vung Tau Army Airfield hosted American aviation units transport squadrons, and logistics personnel. At any given moment in 1968, there were probably more American soldiers in Vung Tau than Australian soldiers. But Vung Tau was not an American base. It was the logistics tail of the 1st Australian Task Force, and the logistics tail wagged its own dog. The port was critical to the Australians and the New Zealanders. The 1st Australian Field Hospital belonged to the Australians. The Peter Badcoe Club, named for an Australian major posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross while serving with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, belonged to the Australians. The Kevin Wheatley Stadium, named for another Australian warrant officer and Victoria Cross recipient, belonged to the Australians. The military police presence that actually enforced curfew and kept drunken soldiers from burning the town down was a joint patrol. Typically an Australian corporal, an American military policeman, and a Vietnamese officer riding together in a Land Rover. Everyone who had ever ridden in one of those Land Rovers knew the open secret. The Australian military police were the ones who actually understood what was happening on the ground. This is the setting into which the rank crisis would explode. And to understand why it exploded, you need to understand something that no American military academy taught in the 1960s. The word warrant officer does not mean the same thing in the Australian Army that it means in the United States Army. The two ranks share a name and almost nothing else. In the United States Army of 1968, a warrant officer was a specialist grade that sat between the enlisted and the commissioned ranks. American warrant officers held their rank by warrant from the Secretary of the Army rather than by commission from the President, but they were treated as officers in almost every meaningful sense. They saluted only commissioned officers. Enlisted personnel saluted them. They wore officer-style insignia. They ate in officer messes. Most famously, in the Vietnam era, the vast majority of American warrant officers were helicopter pilots, young men barely out of their teens who had completed warrant officer flight training and earned the rank almost immediately upon qualification. A 20-year-old American warrant officer climbing out of a Huey gunship at Nui Dat was essentially a junior officer who happened to fly for a living. By 1970, the number of American warrant officer pilots in the Army had grown from under 3,000 in 1966 to over 12,000, driven almost entirely by the demand for helicopter air crews. The rank was young, it was fast, it was, in a very real sense, distinctly American. In the Australian Army of 1968, a warrant officer was something else entirely. Australian warrant officers were the most senior non-commissioned rank in the Army. They were not junior officers. They were the absolute peak of the enlisted soldier's career. The men who had spent 15, 20, sometimes 25 years working their way up from private through corporal, sergeant, staff sergeant, until they reached the rank that every professional soldier respected above all others. An Australian warrant officer, Class 2, wore a crown on his sleeve and typically held the appointment of Company Sergeant Major. An Australian warrant officer, Class 1, wore the Royal Coat of Arms and typically held the appointment of Regimental Sergeant Major, the senior soldier of an entire battalion. These were not young men. These were not specialists. These were the iron spine of the Australian Army, the keepers of discipline and tradition, men whose word carried more weight in an Australian regiment than the word of a freshly minted lieutenant. They were also, in Vietnam, the hand-selected professionals who made up the bulk of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. When the training team reached its peak strength in 1970, It numbered roughly 227 members, and the overwhelming majority were warrant officers. These were the men who routinely led Montagnard strike companies into combat. These were the men who earned 4 Victoria Crosses between them during the war, making the training team the most decorated Australian unit of the conflict. Warrant Officer Class 2, Kevin Wheatley earned his Victoria Cross and died for it in 1965, refusing to abandon a wounded comrade under Viet Cong fire. Warrant Officers Raheem Simpson and Keith Payne earned theirs in 1969 in the Central Highlands, Payne after leading a scattered company of Montagnards back through enemy lines in a running battle that stretched over several days. So, when an Australian warrant officer walked down a street in Vung Tau in 1968, wearing the crown of a WO2 on his sleeve, he was almost certainly a man with 15 or 20 years of service. He was almost certainly a man who had seen combat in Malaya during the emergency, or in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, or in Korea, or all three. He was almost certainly a man who had personally commanded more men in combat than most American colonels, and he was being addressed in the Australian Army with the respect due to a senior figure whose professional standing was beyond question. But here was the problem. An American soldier looking at that same Australian warrant officer saw a crown on a sleeve, and the American soldier had absolutely no idea what that crown meant. American rank insignia used bars and chevrons and oak leaves and stars. Crowns were a Commonwealth symbol American soldiers had never been taught to recognize. The American assumption, in the absence of any other information, was that a crown was some kind of non-commissioned rank. It looked like a sergeant's patch, vaguely. It did not look like an officer's insignia. And so American soldiers, particularly American military police working checkpoints in Saigon or on the streets of Vung Tau, looked at Australian warrant officers and routinely categorized them as senior enlisted, as sergeants, as men who could be addressed, ordered, even manhandled in the same way American military police would address their own enlisted personnel. This was not a small problem. This was a problem that had been festering quietly since 1966, when the first Australian task force first arrived in country. There had been incidents before. A warrant officer from 3 Battalion Royal Australian Regiment had been stopped at an American checkpoint outside Long Bin in late 1966 and spoken to in a manner he found offensive. An Australian training team warrant officer had reportedly been refused entry to an American officers' mess in 1967 on the grounds that he was not a commissioned officer. These incidents had been handled quietly. Letters had been written. Mild protests had been lodged. But no one had done anything truly effective because the underlying problem was not fixable through memoranda. American soldiers did not know what Commonwealth ranks meant, and American training did not bother to teach them. The incident that would finally force the issue into the open happened on a Thursday evening in July 1968 on Lloy Street in downtown Vung Tau, approximately half a kilometer from the Australian Rest and Convalescence Centre. The Australian warrant officer at the centre of what would become known, in Australian channels, as the Lloy Street incident was a warrant officer Class 2 in his early 40s. He was on 48-hour in-country leave from his posting with the training team in the Central Highlands, where he had been advising a regional force company for 7 months. He was walking back to the Rest and Convalescence Centre after dinner with a group of Australian infantrymen from 4 Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, young men on leave from Nui Dat. It was approaching curfew. The streets were emptying out. The warrant officer and his companions were walking briskly but not running, passing under the striped awnings of closed bars and the shuttered windows of rented villas, when a joint military-police patrol pulled up beside them in a Land Rover. What happened next was, in some sense, entirely predictable. The American military police sergeant who stepped out of the Land Rover was approximately 23 years old. He was on his first tour. He had been in Vietnam for perhaps 4 months. He had probably never met an Australian soldier before arriving in country, and his entire orientation to Commonwealth forces had consisted of a single afternoon briefing during his in-processing at Long Bin. He stepped out of the Land Rover and saw a group of Australians walking briskly toward curfew, and he saw, at the front of the group, a man with a crown on his sleeve. And he made the same mistake that dozens of American MPs had made before him. He read the crown as a senior enlisted rank, and he assumed he was dealing with a senior sergeant who was possibly drunk, possibly out past curfew, and definitely about to be the subject of an immediate check. The Australian military policeman riding in the same Land Rover, a corporal from the Australian Force Vietnam Provost Unit, saw what was happening a full 3 seconds before his American counterpart finished forming the thought. He opened his mouth to intervene. He was too slow. The American sergeant stepped into the warrant officer's path and demanded identification. The warrant officer, polite but firm, produced his identification and stated his rank, unit, and destination. The American sergeant, according to the account reconstructed later through Australian witness statements, then made a critical second mistake. He looked at the identification, saw the words Warrant Officer Class 2, mentally translated that into American terms as a kind of junior warrant officer equivalent to a sergeant, and began to address the Australian in the manner he would have used for an American sergeant suspected of being drunk. He used the warrant officer's surname without rank. He accused him of being intoxicated. He ordered him against the wall. When the warrant officer, with the patience of a man who had been teaching Vietnamese soldiers how to read a compass for 7 months, tried to explain that he was not drunk and that he was a warrant officer Class 2 in the Australian Army, the American sergeant told him in so many words that he did not care what kind of officer the Australian claimed to be, because as far as the American was concerned, the Australian was an enlisted man, and he was going to follow American instructions. And then he produced handcuffs. The Australian corporal in the Land Rover was shouting now, in English, at his American colleague. The American ignored him. The warrant officer did not resist. He turned his head slightly, looked at the American sergeant with an expression that several Australian witnesses would later describe as a kind of sad, exhausted patience, and spoke his famous 8 words. "We do not recognize that rank, young man." The handcuffs clicked shut. What the American sergeant did not understand, what no one had ever bothered to explain to him, was that by placing handcuffs on an Australian warrant officer Class 2, he had just committed an act that in Commonwealth military culture was roughly equivalent to publicly striking a senior field-grade officer. The Australian warrant officer was not complaining that he had been arrested. He was informing the American sergeant, with as much restraint as any human being could have summoned, that the rank structure the American was operating under did not correspond to any rank structure the Australian Army would acknowledge. The Australian was being told, in effect, that the Americans believed they had the authority to handcuff a senior professional soldier whose Australian equivalent standing was closer to that of a major than to that of a sergeant. The cultural gap was that wide, and the Australian corporal in the Land Rover, the one who had been shouting, now made a decision. He told the American sergeant, in language almost certainly not recorded in the official after-action report, that the American sergeant was a complete fool. Then he got on the radio. The Australian Military Police radio net at Vung Tau was run out of the marshal's office at the Military Police Battalion compound. From there, a radio operator could raise the Australian Force Vietnam Provost Unit at Vung Tau, the Australian Task Force headquarters at Nui Dat, and, critically, the duty officer at the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group. Within 90 seconds of the handcuffs clicking shut on Lloy Street, the duty officer at 1st Australian Logistics Support Group knew that an Australian warrant officer had been placed in restraints by an American military policeman. Within 3 minutes, a major in the Australian Provost Corps was in a jeep moving at speed through the darkened streets of Vung Tau. Within 15 minutes, the telephone on the desk of the American Provost Marshal for the Vung Tau area began to ring, and it did not stop ringing for the next several hours. The Australian Warrant Officer, meanwhile, remained perfectly calm. He was placed in the back of the American Land Rover. He was driven approximately 4 blocks to the nearest American military police station, a small cinder block building near the American 36th Evacuation Hospital compound. He was processed in the manner that American MPs processed drunk and disorderly enlisted personnel. He was told to empty his pockets. He was told to sit on a wooden bench. At no point did he raise his voice. Several of the American MPs who were present would later report that the Australian's calmness had begun to unnerve them, somewhere around the point when they realized he had not asked for a lawyer, had not asked to make a phone call, and had not made any of the complaints they would have expected from a drunk sergeant who was about to lose a stripe. He had instead asked, very politely, whether he might borrow a pen and a piece of paper in order to make some notes. The notes he was making, though the American MPs did not know this, were the beginnings of his formal report to his Australian chain of command. The Australian major arrived at the American military police station approximately 22 minutes after the handcuffs had been applied. He was still wearing the field uniform he had been wearing when the phone call came, which is to say, he looked dusty and tired and absolutely furious. He walked in, identified himself as an officer of the Australian Provost Corps, and demanded the immediate release of his warrant officer. The American desk sergeant who took this demand was apparently a veteran of several tours and a man of considerable professional experience. He listened carefully. He looked at the Australian warrant officer still sitting on the wooden bench. He looked at the arresting sergeant, who was standing nervously near the coffee urn, and he made what was, under the circumstances, a very sensible decision. He asked the Australian major to please sit down for a moment while he contacted the provost marshal. Then he picked up the phone. The American provost marshal for Vung Tau was a major himself. He had been asleep when his desk sergeant called him. He was not pleased to be woken up, but as the desk sergeant explained the situation, slowly and carefully, a kind of cold professional dread began to settle over the provost marshal's shoulders. He understood immediately what had happened. He had seen the memoranda. He had read, or at least skimmed, the guidance on Commonwealth ranks. He knew that a crown on an Australian sleeve did not mean what his young sergeant had thought it meant. He also knew, because he was not a fool, that if an Australian warrant officer had been placed in handcuffs by an American military policeman in the middle of downtown Vung Tau, the resulting paperwork could very easily reach the desk of General Crichton Abrams himself by the end of the week. He told the desk sergeant to release the Australian Warrant Officer immediately, to apologize profusely, and to keep the arresting sergeant in the station until further notice. He then got dressed and drove to the station himself. What followed was one of the more remarkable small moments in the history of the Australian-American alliance in Vietnam. The American Provost Marshal arrived. He walked into his own station. He approached the Australian Warrant Officer Class 2, who was by this point still sitting on the wooden bench and still making notes. He apologized. He apologized not in the perfunctory way military men often apologize for institutional failures, but in the deeply personal way one professional soldier apologizes to another for an act of disrespect that should never have occurred. He took the handcuffs off personally. He offered the warrant officer a cup of coffee, which the warrant officer politely declined. He offered to drive the warrant officer personally back to the Rest and Convalescence Center, which the warrant officer also politely declined, pointing out that the Australian major was already present with a jeep. The American Provost Marshal then turned to the Australian major and began a conversation that would go on for approximately 40 minutes, conducted in low voices in a corner of the station, while the arresting sergeant stood at attention against a wall and began, according to one witness account, to visibly sweat through his uniform. The two majors, one American and one Australian, worked out the basic framework of what would happen next. The American Provost Marshal agreed that the arresting sergeant would be formally counseled and placed under additional remedial training on Commonwealth rank recognition. The Australian major agreed that as long as the sergeant was properly disciplined through American channels, the Australian chain of command would not pursue the matter through diplomatic channels. Both men understood that the real failure was institutional rather than personal. The young sergeant had done what his training had prepared him to do. His training had simply been inadequate. The Australian Warrant Officer was driven back to the Rest and Convalescence Center that night. He finished his 48-hour leave. He returned to the Central Highlands and to his regional force company. He submitted his formal report. And that report, along with the Australian Major's report, and along with the American Provost Marshal's report, worked its way up the separate chains of command that ran in parallel throughout the Australian-American military relationship in Vietnam. The reports landed eventually on the desks of senior officers at both Australian Force Vietnam Headquarters and Military Assistance Command Vietnam. What happened next is the part of the story that has been, for decades, difficult to reconstruct in detail because the resulting documents were classified and filed and largely forgotten. But the outlines are visible through the diplomatic correspondence that survives. There was, first of all, a period of intense behind-the-scenes negotiation. Australian authorities made it clear at the highest levels that the Lloy Street incident was not an isolated event. They produced a list of previous incidents. They produced the complaints that had been filed by warrant officers over the previous 2 years. They pointed out, with the kind of understated professional fury that is perhaps unique to Commonwealth military correspondence, that the pattern of incidents could not continue. American authorities, for their part, took the complaints seriously, not primarily because they had suddenly developed deep respect for Commonwealth rank structures, but because they understood the political dynamics of the alliance. The Australians were contributing something like 8,000 troops to a war that required 500,000 Americans. The Australians had their own area of operations in Puak Tui Province, their own chain of command, their own doctrine, their own methods. They had, from the earliest days of their commitment, demonstrated a willingness to push back hard against American operational assumptions when Australian professional judgment disagreed. If the Australians started lodging formal diplomatic complaints about military police misconduct, the resulting press coverage in Australia could have political consequences that no one in Saigon wanted to deal with. So, American authorities acted. In the months following the Lloy Street incident, Military Assistance Command Vietnam issued revised guidance to American provost marshals in country. The guidance was a dry, bureaucratic document, but embedded within it was a sentence that represented a significant institutional concession. The guidance stated, in language that had not appeared in previous American memoranda, that Australian warrant officers were to be treated, for all practical purposes and in all interactions with American military police, as senior commissioned equivalents. They were to be addressed as Sir. They were to be accorded the courtesy due to officers. Under no circumstances were they to be subjected to the kind of casual handling that American military police routinely applied to enlisted personnel. This was, in effect, an institutional recognition that American rank categories did not perfectly map onto Commonwealth rank categories, and that when there was doubt, American soldiers should err on the side of treating Commonwealth warrant officers as officers rather than as enlisted personnel. The guidance did not solve the underlying problem. American soldiers continued to be inadequately trained on Commonwealth rank structures. Additional incidents continued to occur, though at a somewhat reduced rate. But it was a formal acknowledgment of a problem that had, for 2 years, been treated as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings rather than as a systematic institutional failure. The young American sergeant who had placed the handcuffs on the warrant officer received his remedial training. He completed his tour. He went home. His name appears in none of the surviving documents that are publicly available, which is probably merciful for him, because the story of his 20-minute arrest of an Australian Warrant Officer Class II on Lloy Street became a cautionary tale still being told in American provost marshal training courses a decade after the war ended. Do not handcuff Commonwealth warrant officers. You will regret it almost immediately. The deeper story of the Lloy Street incident was a story about professional dignity. Australian warrant officers occupied a specific cultural position in the Australian Army that had no direct American equivalent. They were the men whom younger soldiers turned to for professional guidance. They were the men whom officers, even senior officers, deferred to on matters of tactical detail and unit discipline. They were the keepers of regimental tradition, the institutional memory of their units, the embodiment of the professional standards the Australian Army expected of itself. When one of them was handcuffed on a public street by a 23-year-old American sergeant, the insult was not primarily personal. The insult was to the entire Australian professional military tradition that stood behind him. And the Australian response, the phone calls, and the jeeps, and the red-faced major arriving at the military police station, was the Australian Army defending that tradition against what it perceived as a systemic American failure to understand what Australian professional rank meant. This is perhaps why the incident resonated so widely in Australian military memory. The warrant officer had spent perhaps 90 minutes in American custody before being released with apologies. By the standards of Vietnam, where Australian soldiers had died in rubber plantations and on rice paddies and in the tunnels beneath the long high mountains, an hour and a half of inconvenience was not even worth mentioning. But the incident captured something about the experience of being a small professional army fighting alongside a large conscript army. The experience of being the junior partner in an alliance where the senior partner did not entirely understand who you were. Australians in Vietnam told the story of Lloy Street, quietly and among themselves, because it captured the exact flavor of a frustration that had been present throughout the entire war. The Australian military police, meanwhile, drew their own conclusions. After Lloy Street, the assumption that American counterparts needed cultural education hardened into something closer to doctrine. Australian MP training for Vietnam service began to include increasingly detailed briefings on American rank structures, American legal authorities, and American tendencies to misread Commonwealth insignia. Australian corporals deployed to Vung Tau were instructed, quietly and firmly, that part of their job was to protect Australian personnel from the well-meaning but poorly informed actions of their American colleagues. Australian NCOs learned to watch American military police carefully when Australian soldiers were involved in any incident, to intervene early, to use the radio aggressively, to get Australian officers involved before situations could escalate. The pattern was a kind of quiet, constant translation. It was exhausting work. It was also, according to the Australian military police who did it, absolutely essential to the functioning of the alliance on the ground. The photograph exists. Somewhere in the archives of the Australian War Memorial, there is a black-and-white image from December 1969 showing a joint Australian, American, and Vietnamese military police patrol starting out for another day's work from its base in Vung Tau. The caption describes how the combination of an Australian, an American, and a Vietnamese could handle almost any situation that might occur in Vung Tau. The caption does not mention Lloy Street. The caption does not mention the revised memoranda. But the photograph itself, if you look at it carefully, tells you something the caption does not. The three men are standing together, but they are not standing identically. Each is positioned according to his own service's standards of bearing and appearance. Each is wearing his own service's weapons and insignia. Each is operating within his own national command structure, coordinating with the others, but not subordinate to them. The photograph is a portrait of the alliance as it actually functioned in Vung Tau. Three separate systems, each working together because they had to, working imperfectly, because that was the only way three separate systems could ever work together. Lloy Street in July 1968 was, in the end, a small story. It produced no casualties. It changed no strategic outcomes. It did not affect the course of the war. But it contained, in compressed form, the entire complicated dynamic of the Australian-American alliance in Vietnam, the larger partner operating on assumptions that did not always fit, the smaller partner responding with patient, professional, quietly furious precision, two military cultures learning to understand each other, one incident at a time, one memorandum at a time, one warrant officer at a time. We do not recognize that rank, young man. 8 words spoken quietly on a humid Vung Tau evening to a 23-year-old American sergeant who had made a mistake that his training had almost guaranteed he would make. 8 words that said, in effect, that the American rank category being applied to the speaker did not correspond to anything the Australian Army acknowledged. 8 words that, in their understated Commonwealth precision, contained more institutional force than any amount of shouting could have produced. The handcuffs came off. The warrant officer finished his leave. The war went on. The Australians kept operating in Phuoc Tuy province the way they had always intended, answering to their own chain of command, fighting their own war, their own way. The Americans kept being Americans, kept being larger and louder and less patient than their allies would have preferred, kept making assumptions that did not always fit the realities in front of them. But they learned slowly that when a man wearing a crown on his sleeve walked down a street in Vung Tau, that crown meant something specific, and something that American training had not adequately prepared them to understand. They learned because an Australian warrant officer had, on a Thursday evening in July 1968, said 8 quiet words that forced them to learn. We do not recognize that rank, young man. The rank, of course, was not his. The rank was theirs. They had applied American rank categories to an Australian soldier, and the Australian had informed them that those categories did not fit. And in that small moment of correction, on a humid street in a coastal town most Americans could not have found on a map, the institutional machinery of 2 Allied militaries had been forced to grind forward another inch toward genuine mutual understanding. The Australians had done the work of translation themselves, with the kind of quiet professional dignity that rarely makes it into the official histories. But the memorandum exists, the photograph exists, the story exists, and the story, such as it is, belongs to a warrant officer Class 2, whose name has faded from the public record, but whose 8 words still carry, for anyone willing to listen carefully, the full weight of an army defending itself.